My journey to Indiecade East 2015 was long and chilling. There were bus rides, there were train rides, and there was a final taxi ride, followed by a little bit of walking. Overall, however, it was quite worth the trek. In case you've not heard of it, Indiecade East is the East Coast's Festival of Independent Games. In 2015, Indiecade East took place at the Museum of the Moving Image in Astoria, in Queens. Unlike other gaming events, such as the Penny Arcade Expo, Indiecade East is very small. The atmosphere is very relaxed. It feels more like a daylight cocktail party where people are walking around and discussing video games academically than a traditional gaming convention. Of course, don't let that put you off if you're not in the mood for academic discussions of games. There is lots of fun to be had at Indiecade. 2015 was my first Indiecade, and I realized that it was different from other gaming conventions when I walked in and a group of school children were bounding down the stairs towards me. It was some sort of field trip, and the kids were obviously having a very good time, but at the same time they were also learning. So unlike other gaming conventions which may be more commercially focused, Indiecade has a heavy artistic slant. I attended Indiecade East on a Friday. I saw some very interesting things, talked to some interesting people, and in general overused the word interesting. The thing is, at Indiecade, it's hard not to overuse the word interesting because everything there is of some interest in some capacity. There are games that explore the human condition, so human interest games. There are games that might scratch your itch to travel to the stars, so space interest games. There are special interest games. Everything at Indiecade is interesting. Without further ado, here are some highlights from my Indiecade East 2015 experience. I promise you, these things are all fascinating. The first game I checked out at Indiecade East 2015 was Helldivers, a top-down shooter coming to the PS4, PS3, and PS Vita on March 3rd, 2015. The game is satirical. It takes place in a dystopia that's a bit like the world of Starship Troopers. Your goal is to run around the galaxy spreading democracy, and by spreading democracy, you're really just spraying bullets into alien foes. When we played the game, it was not in a finished state, and at the request of Sony, we've not posted any of the gameplay video from Indiecade East. So while we don't have footage, we do have the next best thing: memories. So what I can tell you about the game is that it does play very well for a top-down shooter. If you enjoy games like Halo Spartan Assault, or Alien Swarm, free top-down shooter that Valve released a few years ago, you'll definitely have a good time with Helldivers. One of the notable facets of the game that the Sony rep mentioned to me was that parts of the game are rather dynamic. After I reached a certain part of the level, for instance, it was possible to airdrop in a mech. So I did this, and the rep mentioned to me that it's possible to drop the mech on top of a boss in order to defeat it. It's a little thing, but it's a neat touch to the game. If you're a fan of the genre, I recommend checking it out. After I played a bit of Helldivers, I headed upstairs to the second floor where I found the Indiecade East 2015 eSports Showcase. There, some folks were sitting on benches before a large screen, playing some Screen Sheet. In case you've not heard of Screen Sheet, we have a review of it up at blackmanandrobin.com. It's a rather unusual take on the first-person shooter. It's inspired by split-screen games, where you would be cheating if you looked at the other player's side of the screen. The thing is, in Screen Sheet, everybody's invisible. You can only beat your opponents by figuring out where they are based on what you see of their view. It's a very creative game. We have a review up on blackmanandrobin.com if you want to check it out. But the esports arena at Indiecade was a pretty chill area. If you are looking for a place to sit down, get yourself oriented, the esports area was perfect for that. But I couldn't stay at the lovely little esports arena forever, so I had to move on to the next floor. Here on the third floor of Indiecade East 2015 was the Showcase. It was an exhibitions gallery of different games. Now there were three main areas on the third floor. The first was Love and Rejection, which featured such games as Lovers in a Dangerous Space-Time, Gone Home, Snuggle Truck, Wolfenstein 3D for some reason, Gravitation, and various others. On the Horizons room, on the other hand, there was Choice Chamber, Fracked OSC, Framed, Hack and Slash, Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, Vietnam Romance, and others. The final area was called Gesture, and it was just for Oculus Rift experiences that included the Leap Motion device. I'll be sure to get to that later. In the Horizons area, one of the games I checked out was called Choice Chamber. Choice Chamber seems mostly like your average platform. You run around, you jump on things, and you fight monsters, but it's not exactly that. You see, Choice Chamber isn't so much about the choices that you make as the choices that your audience makes. The game was designed to be played on Twitch. The people watching you play Choice Chamber live can vote on what happens to you next. Will you get a certain power-up or weapon, or will they make the game harder for you by spawning bigger enemies? Choice Chamber is a take on the platforming genre that only seems to be able to exist in the 21st century. If it's a success, we may see more games of its sort in the future. I got to talk to Michael Molinari, the game's developer. He gave me some wonderful insights into the game's creative process.
The biggest challenge is that it's never been done before. There's nothing to compare it to. Now, the type of game it is nothing fancy. I purposely made that a very familiar type of game, so that part people would understand very clearly. But the interesting part, of course, is the live interaction mechanic, and no other game did it before me, and since I started over a year ago, no game has really done it as well.
While I was up there, I also got to talk to Wilbur Yu of Leap Motion. What I learned was that the Leap Motion is a device that attaches to your virtual reality headset, be it an Oculus Rift or something different, such as the Samsung Gear VR. One of the experiences being shown off was Planetarium. It was designed to showcase the abilities of Leap Motion in action. Interacting with it felt a little bit awkward initially, but once I got the hang of it, it was incredible. I could reach up and touch the stars, and not only could I touch them, but I could grab them and manipulate them in my hands, and I could really see how a constellation is formed in the sky. The entire experience felt like something out of a science fiction film. I was reaching out and grabbing something that wasn't actually there, but my brain was sufficiently fooled into feeling that it was. It worked in much the same way that holograms and those fancy floating displays work in sci-fi films. It was, on the whole, a serendipitous experience that I wasn't expecting to have so early in the 21st century.
That you see here is actually it's mapped according to what they are in reality. So, for instance, if I were to change the day, you can actually see the constellations moving. Same with the month and the hour.
Another Leap Motion experience that I appreciated was called Aboard the Looking Glass. Created by Henry Hoffman, it's a sci-fi game about time set in outer space. Because it's a short experience, I'm not going to say too much for the sake of spoilers. However, to get through Aboard the Looking Glass, you have to do a little bit of interdimensional puzzle solving.
Next, if you could raise your right. That's it. You've created a link to the future. Right, let's get you out of here. If you press the switch to your left... it looks like there's some damage. Maybe check out the other time frames? Great. Looks like you've got the hang of it.
In the Love and Rejection exhibit, I got to interview Alex Jansen, the developer of Pipe Trouble, which was a rather controversial game for the wrong reasons. As you might have guessed, Pipe Trouble is a game that involves pipes, specifically laying down pipelines for the sake of transporting natural gas. It's a video game about what happens when capitalism bumps up against environmentalism. It's a seemingly innocuous project, but it did meet with some resistance. Take a look at the interview and you'll find out why.
It's really tracking well in the games community. And then in the midst of that, there was the oil and gas lobby got concerned because it's not particularly flattering to either side, really. I mean, it uses humor as a tool, as a way of kind of as an entry point. But we found what ended up happening was the oil and gas lobby took concern, and then one of the newspapers approached the premier of our province of Ontario about how it was a taxpayer-funded terrorism game where you're actually playing as a bomber with the intention of blowing up pipelines which you aren't. I mean, you're the pipe player. You need to be avoiding, amongst all these things, it's fines, injunctions, protests. The absolute most extreme case would be a bomb. And again, that's rooted in what was actually happening when the Peace River Region 6 bombs in a 2-year period. So it's all real-world issues, but that are being explored in there. But it was flipped, and I think what the case was, it was people who hadn't actually played the game. And so the idea was that they're enraged about a game that I'd be equally enraged about, but that game doesn't really exist.
Interesting. So they will the fiction of...
Yeah. Well, in the end, I think what helped is that, what resolved it was actually, people playing it. And what it actually drew attention to was a larger issue than I would have expected around kind of game literacy within media, and then also kind of outdated assumptions around video game. We had a lot of people where the idea was that it somehow, was targeted at kids specifically, and it very much wasn't. I mean, all these things it's in the stats, but the average gamer is 31 years old, and it's a perfect medium for engaging an audience that has the single worst in North America.
So it was like sort of... My last interview wasn't of a developer at all, but rather of a man who seeks to help developers. I got to chat with Chris Dwyer, who runs a company called Junklatch. Junklatch isn't an indie game publishing company, rather it's more along the lines of an indie game PR company, but not in an entirely traditional sense. Seeing Junklatch really reminded me of what's going on in the indie game community right now. Your game can be really great, but unfortunately, because there are so many indies vying for attention, there's a good chance that your game might go unnoticed. So while I hadn't heard of Junklatch before Indiecade, I have a feeling that if the market continues going on as it has been, Junklatch is going to be very important in the future. In addition to interviews, I got to attend a number of very interesting panels. The first was called Software and Hardware in Post-Communist Central and Eastern Europe. Presented by James Anapaikos, it was a talk that covered computing with a slant towards gaming in the post-communist world. For instance, Famiclones were very popular in Russia. In case you've not heard of the Famiclone, know that the Famiclone was the family computer from Nintendo. The United States got its own version of the Famicom, called the NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System. In Russia, however, the Famiclones introduced a lot of people to gaming, even though they had some very bizarre titles. Games for the Famiclones seemed like the equivalent of video game remixes. They mashed together sprites and gameplay from different games. These were ROM hacks, and as such, they were often glitchy and sometimes couldn't be completed. But in spite of it, they were tremendously successful. Mr. Anapaikos' talk also goes into detail about the demo scene in Russia, as well as the way that computing back then has affected telecommunications now. Even if the technical aspects of making complex 3D animations on simple 8-bit computers doesn't excite you, the talk is fascinating because it explores various technologies and culture that emerged. My next panel was Becoming Playfluent, Building Global Interaction, and it was hosted by Joe Spradley, and the focus was mostly on culture of the video game industry in South Korea, and on building bridges between the industry in both the East and the West. If you're a developer contemplating bringing your games over to South Korea, it's absolutely worth watching. It contains not only important information about doing business in South Korea, but also on what's important with regards to localizing your game. My last panel was Alex Fleetwood's Hardware, Software, People, Games. Fleetwood explores ideas of creating play spaces, actual physical places, permanent homes for video games. At some point in time, video game arcades were all the rage. Unfortunately, they've declined in popularity over the years. What Spradley spoke about bringing back was a sort of social element to games that seems to be lacking today. Video games have their digital spaces, sure, but to what physical spaces do we flock for video games? Besides conventions and the occasional festival, there aren't any permanent homes for games. What Spradley talks about is creating physical installments for games, something falling between art museum and movie theater, with perhaps a little bit of sports arena thrown in. It's a fascinating talk, and it's absolutely worth a listen. All in all, I had a fantastic time at Indiecade East 2015. I experienced strange and amazing new games. I met both people who created and people who studied games, and I overall got to abuse the word interesting because, simply put, Indiecade is interesting. If you attend an Indiecade, you might not only catch a glance of where gaming history is gone, but where games are headed in the future. If you ever attend Indiecade, be sure you go with an open mind as to what sort of new games you're willing to experience, and with open hands in order to properly grasp various controllers. You're going to touch a lot of controllers that day, so you might also want to bring hand sanitizer, just saying. But being serious, you will have a good time at Indiecade.